Today we're going to continue in our series on the book of James. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 1, verses 13 through 18. And the title you see in your bulletin is Identifying Temptation's Source. A lot of times we have trouble figuring out where does temptation come from, but James is very, very clear. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about how good God is. And next week we're going to take the next two verses and just talk about how God is the giver of good gifts. Okay? James chapter 1, verses 13 through 18 is the text for today. And I want to read that for you. James chapter 1, verses 13 through 18. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desires he is dragged away and enticed, that after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of his truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. Marcus Antonius, also known as Mark Antony, was a famous Roman general, and he eventually rose to the heights of being one of the three co-rulers of the Roman Empire. But Marcus Antony had a problem. As brilliant of a tactician as he was, as brilliant of a thinker as he was, as charismatic as he was, and able to sway people with his pearly tongue and oratory, he was one who had significant moral temptations and moral issues. And he fell to them on a regular basis, even to one point that one of his tutors got so frustrated with him being so spoiled, even at a younger age, said to him, "Oh, Marcus, oh, colossal child, are you to conquer the world but unable to resist temptation?" James wants to tell us about temptation and where temptation comes from. But before we do that, we'll talk about some of the things that we think about temptation, whether we say it out loud or whether we just think it in our hearts. Because as we walk through life and fall into some of the traps regarding temptation and its source, we need to dispel them before we can really start talking about what James tells us. Sometimes you hear people say, "The devil made me do it." Right? That good old Flip Wilson comeback. The devil made me do it. The devil's the one that makes me sin. The devil's the one that does it. Other people would say, so-and-so made me do it. If they wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have done that. They made me do it. It's somebody else's problem. It's not mine. You know, I had no choice. I didn't have a choice. I had to do it. You know, I was just compelled. I couldn't help myself. If they would not have done what they did, I wouldn't have done what I had to do. I just had to do it because of what they did. God's just sitting around up in heaven waiting for you to mess up so that he can zap me. You know, God's the one that put these things in my path. If he wouldn't have put them in my path, it wouldn't have been an issue. But God did it. It's God's fault. If God were so loving and good, why would he allow such suffering in the world? You know, it's another way of looking to blame God. He allows disease and he allows sickness. But if he didn't allow disease and sickness, then I wouldn't have to worry about doing what I did. He allows famine. He allows the natural disasters. You know, if the tornado wouldn't have come and ruined all that I had, I wouldn't have to go out and steal. That's God's fault. He let that storm come. the hurtful actions of humans. If men didn't go to war, and if men didn't murder, if men didn't participate in racism and rioting and slavery, I wouldn't have to worry about doing the things that I did in order to combat that. And if God is all-powerful, he could just correct it all. If he just helped me out, if he just did what he needed to do for me, I wouldn't have a problem. Why does it seem like every time I pray for something and I get the opposite? When I pray for patience, God gives me trials to just test me even more. When I pray for a good job, the only thing that's open isn't good enough for me. When I pray for a good spouse, look what I ended up with. When I pray for good health, then God gives me sickness instead. If God were just show more love, then I wouldn't have to worry about dealing with these things. And if God would get me the things that I needed, I wouldn't have to worry about getting them myself. It's God's fault. The word that James is giving us is, he's really pointing the finger where it needs to be pointed. And he's going to demonstrate to us that it's not God's fault, and it's not somebody else's fault. The trouble with temptation, the enemy of temptation, is us. And he begins by using a word that he used in verses 2 through 12. And that word is, we're told, he tests. God tests us. And James says, count it all joy, my brothers, when God brings these tests and these trials into your life, because he's going to use them positively, because he's going to use them to be able to show you the places that need to be improved. And as you work with him and improve those things. So these tests come to prove how pure you are. The tests come to show you where your weaknesses are so that you can improve those. The tests come so that you can rely upon God to be the person he created you to be. But this Greek word, is really a double-edged coin. On the one side, it's talking about tests in the positive. On the other side, in another context, it's translated temptation, because it goes to the evil side. It goes to not a good result, but an evil result. The temptation is that which gives us desires to do things contrary to what God would have us to do. So at first he's saying, God tests, and now he's saying, but temptation doesn't come from God. That negative side of the coin, the negative side of that word play, is not from God. Rather, it's from someplace else. Many years ago, if you recall, it was all in the news, the Air Force Academy, there were cadets that were caught cheating. The big thing about the military academies is they run by the honor system. And officers need to be honest. And gentlemen should be honest. And so the staff, the teachers, didn't really police. They were to police themselves. And they were to make sure that they kept and maintained their honesty. But the scandal went through the Air Force Academy. Cadets had been found getting the tests in advance of the test and having their study groups to go over the tests before going and taking the test. They were cheating. And you could hear it be said when they were brought up on their expulsion charges that, if they wouldn't have trusted us so much, if they wouldn't have left the tests to be easily accessible to us, then we would have never cheated. It's their fault for making it so easy for us to cheat. Because after all, competition is so high, competition is so hard, you have to be almost perfect. And nobody can get to that high of an achievement. And so we have to find ways to accomplish that. And they made it so easy. So it was their fault. It wasn't our fault. See, the problem with this is it's only when there's a core of dishonesty within a person that they can't work through an honor system. The honor system becomes a downfall for somebody who has a core that isn't honest and brings that temptation for them to go to that dishonest side instead of the honest side. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this about temptation. In our members, there is a slumbering inclination towards desire, which is both sudden and fierce. With irresistible power, desire seizes mastery over the flesh. All at once, a secret smoldering fire is kindled. The flesh burns and is in flames. It makes no difference whether it is sexual desire or ambition or vanity or desire for revenge or love or fame or power or greed for money, or finally the strange desire for the beauty of the world, of nature. Joy in God is in course of being extinguished in us, and we seek all our joy in the creature. At this moment, God is quite unreal to us. He loses all reality, and only desire for the creature is real. The only reality is the devil. Satan does not here fill us with hatred of God, but forgetfulness of God. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer saying, temptation finds its root in our desires. And that's what James has told us. James clearly points out in this passage that temptation comes from within the heart of a man or a woman. He says, God is never the source of temptation. That's the first and most important and crucial truth of this passage, is that God is never the source of temptation. God can't be the source of temptation because God is holy and God is love. And a holy and loving God would never tempt his children to do something that wasn't loving or something that wasn't holy. God is perfect, and in him there is no imperfection. Temptation is an imperfection to the order that God designed. So God can't tempt, and he can't be tempted, because that would disrupt the order that he created, and he can't do anything contrary to the order that he created. God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, and God is ever-present, and as such, he can't be tempted because nobody can pull the wool over his eyes. And even if they are trying to pull the wool over his eyes, he's all-powerful to stop that. And he's ever-present, so he knows whenever the devil tries to trick. So God can't be tempted, nor does he tempt. God does not tempt anyone. God will bring tests to our lives to show us where we are in relationship to him, so that we can realize we need to be dependent upon him and seek his power and his strength to accomplish what he wants to accomplish in our lives. But God does not tempt. He does not draw us into temptation. That's the first truth. The second truth is that we're always the source of our own temptation. James is very clear. Temptation begins in the heart of man and woman. It doesn't begin anyplace else. It begins in the heart of man and woman. The desires, the deep down desires of a man or a woman. That is what is the basis of temptation. The consequences of the curse is that all of creation was corrupted. All of creation was corrupted. God gives us all desires that he wants us to fulfill. Any desire that you have is at root a God-given desire to have. The temptation is to acquire or fulfill that desire in a way that God never intended. And so we want to circumvent God's plan. We want to get that desire in the fastest, easiest way instead of going through God's plan. And so there then is the basis of temptation. We want to fulfill those desires in ways that God never intended. And that's because the curse brought spiritual death to us. We're not quickened to God. Our desires are desires in the opposite direction of God until we're saved. When we're saved, those old desires and those old ways of thinking are not eradicated. The old is gone and the new has come, and that means what Mark is telling us is that the new nature comes within, but it doesn't eradicate the old fleshly nature that's corrupted by sin. That can only be eradicated at redemption, when the eternal redemption of heaven and the earth and of our bodies takes place. Until then, there's a battle, there's a war that goes within. That war between the spiritual that has been awakened to God and the fleshly side, that old nature which wants to draw us back into those ways of thinking. And so what James is telling us is that temptation finds its source in our desires. It finds its source in our desires. And when our desires seek to be accomplished in ways other than God's plan, that's the temptation that leads us down the path to sin. The world, the flesh, and the devil don't make us do it. The world, the flesh, and the devil don't make us do it. They may whisper in our ears. They may say, "Oh, God surely didn't mean that." Or surely, because God's a God of love, he would want you to have that. Or God would have never allowed you to meet that person if he didn't want you to be with that person. Who cares that you're married? You know, they may whisper. They may seek to convince us that there are appropriate alternative ways to get what we want. You want to have knowledge. You want to have the knowledge of God. Well, if you eat from the tree that God told you to not eat from, you'll have all the knowledge God is holding back from you. There's another way to get that knowledge. You don't have to do it God's way. Just eat from that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and you'll have it. They whisper. They tempt. They try and tell us that there's another way. But they can't make that choice for us. The devil didn't put his hand on Eve's hand and push her hand and force her to grab that fruit. Nor did he force it and push it into her mouth so that she would bite of it and swallow it. Eve said, "Oh yeah, it does look good. Maybe that is something I should have." Pluck it and eat it. It was her choice. Satan knows our strengths and our weaknesses. He knows the bait which will most readily entice us. He wisely meets our tendencies to lust or desire and then offers us the bait, just as surely as he offered the forbidden fruit to Eve. You anglers out there, you know the best way to get a fish isn't to throw the hook into the water. The fish isn't that dumb. Well, I've known some fish to be that dumb. But most fish won't go after this metal hook dangling in the water. There's bait attached to it, which that fish says, yum, this is good. I don't have to dive to the bottom and scurry around trying to find good, delectable things to eat. It's sitting right there in front of me. I'm going to go for it. And they bite, the hook's set, and they're done. The world, the flesh, and the devil can put the bait on the hook, but they don't put the hook in your mouth. You're the one that decides, oh, that's good. I want it. They may set the stage for temptation, but they are not the basis of the temptation. James is telling us the temptation comes from within. Our evil desires entice us and drag us away. Our evil desires are hidden in our hearts. And when they start to bubble up, we start to think about it. Oh, maybe I could do this. Oh, maybe I could do that. Then we ruminate on them. They fill our minds, which possibly is sin. Jesus said, as you think, so you act. And therefore, even the thought of sin, if you're really seriously thinking about doing it, is sin in and of itself. Just the thought by itself might not be sin, but you can have sinful thoughts. But desire then kicks in, and with that desire, those thoughts really do become sin. And then once we have those sinful desires and sinful thoughts, the next thing is that we do it, which is sin. And sin begets death. So James says God doesn't tempt anyone. The enemy that we have to identify is ourselves. We are the source of every one of our temptations. Because our temptation is to do things and to obtain the desires of our hearts in a way that God never intended for us to obtain them by. Those desires at their core are desires that God put into our hearts. But how we fulfill those desires need to be by God's design and not by ours, and not by the devil's, and not by the society that which we live in, not by the world, not by the flesh, but by the Spirit. To overcome the enemy behind temptation, it must first be identified. And that enemy, James has identified, it's us. Though the world, the flesh, and the devil can be agents that can lead us to temptation, the true enemy behind temptation is ourselves, in that temptation finds its headwaters in our hearts and in our desires to accomplish those desires in a way that God never intended. Having identified the enemy, we need a strategy to neutralize the enemy within. If we can learn to identify the ways that God would have us to fulfill those desires, that is that we place those in our hearts since he placed those in our hearts since the dawn of time, we'll be able to neutralize the enemy if we only focus on the way that God wants us to accomplish those desires. And the enemy within will be vanquished and will gain the victory that God promises. There's one specific thing that you learn in obedience training with a dog that sets the stage for whether the dog is going to obey or not obey. Most obedience courses are 6 weeks long, and the one thing that they teach you is to maintain eye contact. Because as you maintain eye contact with your dog's focus is upon you and not upon the surroundings that it's within. And as long as you give instruction with eye contact and that dog has eye contact with you, success is pretty much assured. Now, there's some dogs that forget that. But for the most part, if you maintain that eye contact and with the master and the dog will listen to the commands, and the more certain he is to be oblivious to the distractions around him and be obedient to his master. I believe that this is the message that James is trying to teach us. We need to fix our eyes on God. We need to fix our eyes on the mind of Jesus. We need to tune into his frequency and not the frequency of the devil and not the frequency of the world and not the frequency of the flesh. We need to trust him fully and constantly. We need to depend upon his strength and wisdom and power, and he will give us the victory if we keep our eyes upon him. But then, there's always the choice. Will I or won't I? And that's the question for us today. What are we going to do when temptation begins to rear its head? Are we going to think about it, or are we going to look into the eyes of Jesus? Let's pray. Father, thank you for your love, and thank you for this word to remind us that when temptation comes our way, though the devil, the flesh, and the world may set the stage for us to bite, it's still ultimately our choice. And if we would choose rather to look into your eyes, to seek your path for fulfilling the desires that you've placed within us, then we will have the victory over the enemy of temptation, which is within our hearts all alone. Guide and direct us and help us to keep our eyes fixed upon Jesus. For we ask these things in his name. Amen. Let's greet one another.